Again, I don't know if you could put some numbers on it, but like how much does compost increase the yield? Have you done nutrient analyses? Like how much does good
So
organic compost increase the nutrient levels?
it depends on the compost, and that's why this gets more challenging, right? If you have a compost pile, it can vary from year to year. You'd have to test in the lab. Where we have mixed organic amendments that are dried plant materials and minerals, those are going to have a reliable amount of nutrients every time you use them. Or compost, it varies a lot. So we carry a fish compost from the Pacific Northwest. We carry a biodynamic cattle compost from Organic Dairy Farm, and that's Malibu biodynamic compost, and they have different nutrient profiles. And so that's why we recommend soil testing, because we want to maximize the budget. And oftentimes most of the fertility is done through the dry amendments and minerals, and the compost is added as an extra to make sure that now those minerals and nutrients you added to this dead soil, when you add the compost, now you have the buffer that allows it to hold the moisture, have all the biology that break down those soil amendments you added. And once they're broken down biology, the plants can take them up. So the compost is kind of that missing link there. It's what you think of when you think of beautiful, dark, rich soil. And if you're looking at hard clay, sandy, it doesn't look like good garden soil, compost is going to be the quickest way to get there. Now, there's arguments over this in the sense that to make compost, a lot of times a farmer has to grow plants, take the material off the acreage, go pile it in a pile, get the browns and greens right, turn it several times, and then go spread it back out. So the organic no-till movement is more about growing cover crop right on the property and then terminating that cover crop by crimping it so that all of that organic matter dies and essentially turns into compost right there on the property without having to pile it, spread it. And so depending on what your method is, you're going to have to stick a plan and stick with it. So on acreage, a lot of times we're growing the compost in place, and the cover crop not only takes nitrogen from the air, fixes it to the soil, it breaks up and goes deep and improves the texture. But when you chop it and drop it before it goes to seed, you're now releasing all of that nutrient that was from the soil in a much more organic form, because now it's plant matter instead of mineral, and it dies on the surface of the soil. And doing that for a year or two can completely change the structure. We have local farms that are 8.5, 8.6 pH and very difficult to grow in. And after 2 successive crops of cover crop, it looks like a premium farm soil, and they're able to get significantly better results. But for the home gardener with a backyard, growing cover crop and terminating it and do all these things, it might be easier to just add extra bags of compost that's finished. Does that make sense?
Well, how much easier is it if you do cover crop versus trying to just make discrete compost in a big heap and then, shovel it onto the soil?
It takes more planning to do the cover crop and have a plan in place for how long it's going to take to grow, when to terminate it, versus if you just are able to buy really good compost, you're ready to go. And then, of course, making compost is a whole different subject. It takes typically a few different attempts at it to get those ratios right and the moisture right. But once you know how to make compost, it is a lot cheaper. You could get bags of leaves that are left out, talk to your neighbors and friends to bring you the organic matter so you can pile it up. There's always ways to save. But when it comes to like the fastest results, oftentimes we're recommending people build their raised beds garden. It doesn't take a lot of area to feed yourself the amount of food most of our customers want. And so we'll help them build that potting soil from scratch, or get a soil test and design the amendments that they'd be adding to the soil. And I know I'm being vague, but a soil in the Pacific Northwest where it's all volcanic versus one in the high desert might take a very different application as far as the level of...
Give me some examples. So like I'm in Texas. We do have like a lot of, limestone and hard clays and all that. How would I do compost differently from someone in the Pacific Northwest? Like what would I do? What would I put into it differently? Or, how do I make sure it has the right nutrient mix for me?
So really making compost is very similar, but when we were to test the soil, one soil might already be neutral on pH, and it might have plenty of nutrients in it just based on the fact it's in a very abundant region. Like if you're in a good soil on Hawaii or good soil in Washington where there was volcanic activity, versus in the middle of a big area in Texas that may not have had that same activity, it might be devoid. And so now it's very important that the level of compost has more nutrition in it. And for instance, there's local compost that if you were to just add in the same percentages we normally add, it'd be too much. There's too much available nutrients in it. And so when you get the soil test and you find a local compost, most of these yards will have an analysis on it. That's where you put the two together. You say, I have my soil test. I have a few samples of what's available near me. Which one fits the best? And we do that. Because around here, if we're at 8.5 pH and the local compost is 9 pH, because it was made from these similar inputs, it's not going to be helpful. I would rather give you our fish compost that is in the 6.4 pH, and it has a lot higher calcium availability, things that are going to be good in our particular problem. And so we're talking about specifics like this, like which compost, how much we get.
Oh, wait,
we have to.
Wait, so like, yeah, I'll ask you about the testing in a minute, but so have people grown stuff, put compost on it, and it's gotten worse? If it makes the pH like even more basic, let's say, or
yeah, it's possible.
The wrong nutrients.
So sometimes, like I've tested some local composts that are so high in potassium and sodium that when you add it during that initial growing season, it can actually lock out a lot of the nutrients. Other times you'll find compost that's very woody and maybe not fully finished. And so when you add it, it looks good. It has a nice brown texture, but the amount of wood chips that were in it, the biology in the soil goes to break down the carbon in the wood. And it essentially robs all your nitrogen until that carbon is finished cycling. And it could take an entire season. And so we're looking like in our fish compost, it's fully finished. It takes years to make. It's dark black. It has lots of nitrogen. So that would make it a significant improvement the first year. Where the latter compost that was more woody, it might be great a year or two from now. But if you're expecting results this year, the carbon's going to tie up some nitrogen. It might have excessive potassium. And those are the typical things when I test for compost. In fact, most of the times what we're adding to a compost along with it, around here, a lot of the homesteaders, what they would do is they would go get their compost locally, whether it was just manure from the chicken yard or from the cattle yard, and it was aged for a couple of years. They would put that in their garden, but they would add bone meal. And the main reason is bone meal has calcium and phosphorus, which is typically the biggest missing components from a regular compost.